Millions of civilians in war-ravaged countries around the world are bearing the biggest brunt due to the ongoing conflict. Some pay with their lives, while others are displaced. There are about 100 active conflicts globally, with the Israel-Hamas and Russia-Ukraine conflicts toppling the list. Africa has its own share of armed conflicts. Sudan and DRC come to mind. Now, to help us understand the impact of these armed and deadly conflicts on the continent, I'm now joined by the head of International Committee of the Red Cross in Southern Africa, Jules Amoti. A very good morning to you. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika. Thank you for joining us in studio.
Good morning, Paul. I'm pleased to be here with you today.
Over 100 active conflicts worldwide. Africa is indeed not spared at all. What is your role as the ICRC in armed conflicts, and how then do you intervene and ensure that parties respect and comply to some regulations?
Yes, to start by presenting ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross. We are a Geneva-based organization. We are neutral, independent and impartial organization. Yes. And our objective is to ensure protection, humanitarian protection to the dignity of people affected by the armed conflict, not only armed conflict but also other situations of violence. This is one thing, to allow them accessing to the aid, to what is needed to preserve their lives and their dignity. This is one thing. And this goes along with promoting international humanitarian law. And all states and parties in conflict must comply with this legal framework to ensure the dignity, the protection and the assistance of those affected by the armed conflict, and we're the guardian of this international humanitarian law.
A very challenging job and role indeed. I mean, you make mention of the word dignity, and we know that the ongoing conflicts have devastating humanitarian consequences, not only on the territories that armed conflicts erupt every day, but also to the countries that are not even part of it, nor close to it. How do you manage your work around that sort of scenario?
Yeah, I mean, ICRC, we have 100, we work in 100 countries in the world. And we have structures, we have countries where we have our team directly based to discuss with different authorities and all those who are involved in armed conflict, and we call them parties in the conflict.
Yeah.
And also we make sure that we are close to the communities, because most of the activities that we do with the communities, mainly in hard-to-reach areas where other humanitarian organizations cannot go. Our objective is to ensure that we have the access to these places, and access implies also discussing with authorities, with the de facto authorities, those who control areas, and to give us safe access where our team can be deployed, assess the needs, and provide the required humanitarian assistance. It's not only that side, but also see with the donors, because need that we address depend on the financial capacities of the organization, and also to see if we can have more funding to better assess the needs. Now, when we talk about the needs, it's a wide range of the needs. Basic needs to maintain people alive, which means access to water, food, and also access to medical facilities and housing, which is normal human life. Human beings must have access to these basic needs. And then we see for the longer term. The problem is today we see the conflict lasting longer in many countries. We call them protracted armed conflict. That's obliged us as well to adapt the way we address the need throughout what we call the phases of conflict, starting by pre-conflict situation where we see the tensions between the state or some stakeholders, and we try to promote humanitarian diplomacy, reminding their obligations around international humanitarian law to prevent the violence. Now, during the conflict, we came in to remind the application of the law and to assure safe access, and that people who are affected can access to the aid. Then when we have the protracted conflict that lasts longer, like in the DRC, in many countries in the world, we can see the Sudan. The conflict in Sudan has been there for a long time. Yeah. We see the situation in Israel, between Israel and Gaza. This is protracted conflict in Libya. If you see some countries in Africa, we see Ethiopia, we see Mozambique is going through long-term conflict as well. we try to ensure that the international humanitarian law is respected. We remind with stakeholders, being civilians, military stakeholders, to allow us to do our work on the ground.
Yeah, and that must come with its own challenges. I mean, you make mention of the Israel-Gaza situation, and we also know medical supplies and access to supplies was a massive, massive challenge. How would you then become the voice of reason in that regard in ensuring that people who are injured have access to medical supplies, because it is essentially a matter of life and death?
Yeah, indeed, you know, we remind the obligation of the state involved in armed conflict, but also we have some states who play very influential roles in the conflict zones to make sure that those who are directly involved in the conflict can allow safe access to the humanitarian organizations like the ICRC, also to allow to access those who are affected by the civilians. Access is one thing very important, and access is linked with the security, because humanitarian staff aid workers must have security, convenient security environment to work in the conflict zone. First is safe access. Then also accessing to what is needed, the supplies, to get in the conflict zone and to help us do our work. We see medical supplies, some supplies linked directly to the surgeons, because people are wounded during the armed conflict. They need water, they need medicines, they need other facilities that we promote to say, let's have safe access, and then to have all the logistics needed to respond to the humanitarian needs.
You speak about not meddling in politics and really trying to stay independent and be that voice of reason in ensuring human rights and dignity. Does the ICR play a role at all in finding ways that could resolve the conflict? How do you fit into that space?
The conflict resolution per se is under the UN mandate, the United Nations mandate. This is one thing. And then we have regional organizations such as African Union, and also we have regional economic communities like the SADC in Southern Africa, and we have some influencing states like South Africa. I would like to recall a few cases that I saw good practices from South Africa.
Yes.
We did have some conflict in the DRC, the so-called second war in the DRC. That started in 1998. And we saw very active role played by the South Africa to pull in South Africa all stakeholders. And they have very long discussions in Sun City to get a peace agreement that was signed in April 2003. This is one of the best practices to show how the states that can have good influence can play this role, because it's a political role and we are not a political organization. Yeah. Second case we saw with the situation between the government of Ethiopia and the Tigray, and stakeholders were brought here in South Africa last year, and they signed this peace agreement for the Tigray. There are many cases around the world. The problem is ICRC, we are neutral, independent, and impartial organization. We are not directly involved in the conflict resolutions because this is a mandate of others. But whenever conflict resolutions discussions are taking place, we came to remind the application of international humanitarian law, as we said, to help us also implement our mandate. Whether the situation cools down and then reach to the peace, and the risk we see there, if we are involved in the conflict resolution and then it fails, it may jeopardize our image and also the credibility of the organization, because we work with all parties involved to ensure that civilians who are affected can be accessible, and to help us also do our job with all the gain of confidence and trust between the stakeholders involved. That's why we are not actively involved in conflict resolution, but we remind the law.
When it comes to the sort of impact on civilians' lives, many who've lost their lives, how does your organization ensure that fighters who violate the law of armed conflict are then held accountable. Accountability has been a big word, especially just looking at the remarks of President Cyril Ramaphosa just yesterday and over the past few weeks, speaking around the Hamas Gaza situation, and also speaking about the ICC calling for urgent intervention there and accountability. Where do you fit in when it comes to ensuring accountability when it comes to the confines of the law?
I mean, we start by, again, as I said before, promoting the international humanitarian law that prevents misbehaviors, if I may call it, during armed conflict. The state have the obligations to prosecute the cases. That's why we have a lot of promotion of international humanitarian law with the state, to let them understand what the legal framework says. And also, when the state doesn't have direct access to some areas, we remind the same obligations to those who are conducting hostilities, like non-state armed groups, to say the international humanitarian law must be complied with. Now we have international legal framework platform that prosecute directly the violation of the IHL, but our role is in documenting the cases of the violation, and we also support the state to embed these laws in the national regulations to allow the state as well to be able to prosecute the case directly, first to investigate, and then once they have evidences and to prosecute based on the national law. If some state fails, and then we see the cases are going to international criminal court.
I understand you recently held an IHL Regional Seminar. What were some of the outcomes of it, and why the importance, considering, some level of quietness within the region?
Yeah, the region is very quiet, but we only have one conflict in Mozambique, and then we have DRC among the SADC countries, the 16 SADC countries. Why we are having this regional IHL international international humanitarian law seminars in Pretoria? First, because we have very conducive environment with the South African government and also the state from the SADC countries. It's peaceful countries, but we make sure that we promote this legal framework within the countries as the prevention measures, and for them also to integrate in their national regulations to develop the best practices. But the second reason is also SADC troops, they used to deploy peacekeeping missions, not only in Africa, probably outside Africa. We see under UN, contingent missions like today we have many SADC countries deploying troops in Central African Republic under UN. We have troops from Malawi, from Zambia to some countries. We have troops from South Africa still under MONUSCO in the DRC. And also we have the SAMIM in Mozambique coming from the SADC countries. When they go on military operations, they must comply as well with this international humanitarian law as part of the legal bodies that applies to the armed conflict situation. And this is why we have best practice. The outcome is every country comes to see where they stand with the integration of this law in their national or domestic law, and to see what are the challenges they are facing, and how can we as ICRC helping them to address these challenges collectively and to develop best practices with the state. For me, it's the best cases we are seeing, and we have collective support from the South Africa and other governments like Lesotho that is co-chairing with us this year. Last year it was Botswana co-chairing these international regional law committees with the ICRC as an international organization. But beside of this one, we have also a series of activities that we do in Southern Africa. One is consists to promote the protection of the family links. That's still under the ICRC mandate, because many people are coming to South Africa linked to the armed conflict, fleeing violence in their home countries. We see many people coming to South Africa, coming from Ethiopia, Somalia, Nigeria, DRC, and other countries to South Africa to ensure that they remain connected with their family members staying home. This is one thing that we do. And on the way, some went missing, deceased. In the past, one of my colleagues, expert in forensic, came also for a few discussions with the newsroom here to explain about our forensic activities, to identify those who are unidentified. And we have a lot of cases in Southern Africa. And also we train the state services to have best practices on how to address this need directly. The last point is also our promotion with the national societies of the Red Cross in the SADC countries to allow them as well doing the humanitarian activities where ICRC can support financially, training, etc., to raise their capacities and to work independently. And all of this with the support of the state, because our call is to say we cannot do these humanitarian activities if we don't have very good support from the state, influencing state in the countries, to help us as well having more resources and capabilities to deploy our teams everywhere in Africa around the world, which may require some financial resources as well. That's why we're having these IHL seminars in South Africa and to develop best practices as well, and the environment is very conducive.
Mr. Jules, Amoti, let me thank you for your time and really giving us that detailed explanation there. With over 100 active conflicts worldwide, Africa indeed is not spared.